Hello, I'm Lourdes with Native Plant Channel, and I am so excited and happy today to be here with the leader in the native plant movement, Dr. Doug Tallamy. And every time that I hear someone speaking or listen to a podcast or go to a presentation, so many people refer to being influenced by Dr. Tallamy because he is really the leading person through the books he has written, the research that he has done, that is enlightening gardeners into the best way to attract insects and preserve our insects in our gardens. So Dr. Tallamy, thank you so much for doing this for us. We're looking forward to seeing evidence of your research and to learn more from you.
Thanks very much. Evidence of my research is all around you.
That's why we are here.
About.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. We're here at the University of Delaware. We're here at the Botanic Gardens where a lot of Dr. Tallamy's research has taken place. And he's going to lead us through today.
We're in the University of Delaware Botanic Garden, UDBG, a portion of it that is dedicated to native plants. This is a teaching garden, so they have lots of things to teach students about all the different plant groups, but this part is focused on native plants. Years ago, Melinda Zoer, who worked here, came up to me and said, let's start a butterfly garden. And I said, well, okay, but why don't we call it a Lepidoptera garden? For every species of butterfly, there are 19 species of moths, and moths get short shrift. People don't talk about them. People like butterflies because they fly during the day and they're pretty. And that's good enough reason. But they say, well, they're great pollinators. Actually, they're not. They do very little pollinating. They do go to flowers and suck nectar. But it's really the moths that are driving the food web. They create the caterpillars that the birds eat. Most butterflies don't taste very good, so birds don't spend a lot of time eating them. They're depending on moth larvae. We'll just call them caterpillars. So we're going to call this the butterfly garden and talk about butterflies and moths. And the idea was to give the public an idea of what types of Lepidoptera, of butterflies and moths, you can actually attract to your yard if you use the right plants. One of the biggest challenges that homeowners have is reducing the area they have in lawn. Lawn is not very productive. As a matter of fact, it's very unproductive. We've got more than 44 million acres of lawn in the U.S. That's an area bigger than New England. And it's really an ecological deadscape. So I recommend that we reduce the area of lawn. And everybody said, well, what are you going to put there instead? Lots of things, but ground covers are a great way to cover area that used to be lawn. And this is a good ground cover right here. It's called Meadow Anemone. And under the right conditions, it can be very, very thick. The perfect ground cover is one where you're not going to see the ground. It becomes living mulch. That's really important because you don't want bare soil. Bare soil dries out and all the living organisms in that soil then dry out and either move or die because soil is a living community. That's where all the mycorrhizae are. It's where all the detritivores, the thousands and thousands of tiny little things that are chewing up leaves and returning nutrients to the soil. All of those creatures and fungi and other things in soil require high humidity. So that's why we use mulch to keep the humidity in, but living mulch is the very best way to go. Underneath these plants here, there are leaves that are returning the nutrients to the soil that the tree used the year before. And it's a nice, very, very closed system. So picture areas in your yard where you could cover the yard cover what used to be lawn with different types of ground covers, and there's a lot of them. This is just one species. A mixed ground cover is a great way to go as well, where you have diversity of things. Some things that would bloom in the spring, like wood poppies, bloodroot, the spring ephemerals, they bloom in the spring, but the leaves are around the rest of the year, and they're making a very nice ground cover as well.
In the back, guys, is Emma. She is Dr. Tallamy's research student, and she's going to be telling us a little bit more about the research she's doing and a little bit later in the video.
This is one thing people do all the time, is they either get wood shavings or actual wood chips and spread them on the ground. It is better than nothing. It keeps the moisture in, but it actually can solidify and get quite hard. And when that happens in the summertime, it keeps moisture out. It'll rain and it'll run right off the top of those wood chips. It's also a weeding opportunity. because after the spring it loosens all up, then things will grow right through it and you have to weed them out. And you can see that's happened a lot here. Another big problem, really big problem, that residential conservationists, we'll call them, face is invasive plants, ones that are coming in that they don't want there. Invasive plants, of course, are species from other continents that are very poor at supporting our local food web, very poor at supporting local animals. And then we've got one of these back here. This is one of the species of bush honeysuckle. You know, this is a botanical garden. It's maintained mostly by master gardeners, but even though we get 35 people come here and working very hard, these things still sneak in, so it takes constant maintenance. And this is something we brought on ourselves by selling these plants in our nurseries. In many places we still sell a lot of invasives. So then we have to invest the time and energy and money in controlling them, because that plant is adding nothing to this garden. It's also going to escape and move into our natural areas. Just 3/4 of a mile down the street, we have White Clay Creek State Park, and way more than 1/3 of the vegetation in that park is from China. So it's really decreased the value, the ecological value of that park because of our gardening ways. So it's now our responsibility to help remove those plants.
And Dr. Tallamy, honeysuckles can be very confusing because we also have, for example, our northern bush honeysuckle, which is native and is beneficial, as well as the coral or trumpet honeysuckle. So when people are learning about gardening, they hear honeysuckle and they're not sure what to think about it.
Right. The true honeysuckles are in the genus Lonicera, and the bush honeysuckles are in the genus Lonicera. Coral honeysuckle is Lonicera sempervirens, but it's a native. It evolved here as opposed to someplace else. So just because you're in the same genus doesn't mean you're going to provide resources for the things that use it. So for example, coral honeysuckle is a host plant for the snowberry clearwing moth. The snowberry clearwing won't use the bush honeysuckle, so that's called host plant specialization. Even though those two plants are in the same genus, they're not closely related enough. The chemistry of the leaves is not close enough that that moth can't tell the difference, and it'll stick with the one it is co-evolved with. So yeah, it can be confusing. Which brings me to another point I might as well talk about now. I want to see the development of what I'm going to call ecological gardeners, ecological landscaping, where rather than you have to go out and as a homeowner and learn all the stuff that's necessary to have a really ecologically productive yard, you just hire somebody. Most people don't garden at all. They hire a lawn care service and they don't think twice about it. Well, I want you to be able to hire an ecological landscaper and not think twice about it. Let him choose the plants, let her choose the plants, maintain them, install them, and then you know you're doing the right thing without having to invest or worry about it. Now, if you're a gardener, that's great. It's a great way to engage in a new way of interacting with the landscape. But particularly young folks, taking the kids to soccer and school and work and everything else, changing your landscape can be a big ask. So if you're looking for a new career, we need a whole lot more ecological landscaping. It's not a tremendous amount to learn. You could learn everything you need to know in one summer pretty easily. But there's enough that the average homeowner doesn't want to sit down and do it. So think about it, because I guarantee that there's going to be a market for that type of skill. There already is. Every place I go and give a talk, somebody say, who can I hire to do this? And I say, I don't know. Actually, more and more people are putting out their shingles, but we need more than that.
Friends, the conversation Dr. Tallamy and I were having earlier regarding honeysuckles and the confusion regarding their common names illustrates the problem with using common names. And that is why for Native Plant Channel, I always include the botanical name. The botanical name of plants is given as genus and species. And that is because by using this, you will get exactly the plant that you want instead of some invasive. So let's take a look at the example of our native northern bush honeysuckle pictured here. A very tough plant and very beneficial to many bees. So in this case, the genus is Gervilla and the species is Lonicera. And you don't have to worry about knowing how to pronounce it, as long as when you're looking for it, you know that the plant you're being given has Gervilla lonicera on its label, and that way you know you are getting the native that is beneficial to us. So let's take a look at some non-native invasive honeysuckles that you should be familiar with and not buy or remove them if you have them on your property. The yellow and white flowered vine that you see here, you might be familiar with, and many of you might actually enjoy this because it is very fragrant and it's enjoyed by many for its fragrance. But it's actually an invasive vine that damages our local ecosystems and has spread throughout many places. So that is Japanese honeysuckle, Lonicera japonica, and that should be removed from your garden if you have it. There are 3 other honeysuckles that are listed here that you should be familiar with and not buy or remove from your properties if you have them. And if you're new to this, don't be overwhelmed. You have already learned how to use the botanical name for plants in order to get what you want. You will learn so much more in this video through Dr. Tallamy. So stay with us, start small, and any change that you are making will contribute to our world and make your local ecosystem more diverse and better for our pollinators and many other insects.
Notice that I say we should reduce the lawn, but not get rid of the lawn. Lawn still has some very important functions in a residential landscape. It's the perfect plant to walk on because it can take a lot of traffic without being killed. And there are very few plants that can do that. But it ought to be what Thomas Rainer calls area rugs rather than wall-to-wall carpeting. And this is a good example of how to do that. We've got broad swaths of grass that will guide you through the landscape without covering the entire landscape. So the good things about that is it's not disturbing the watershed as much as a couple acres of lawn would. Lawn does not provide food or nectar for pollinators, although we do have some clover coming up here and that provides a little bit. But most people put broad spectrum herbicides on the grass to kill any broadleaf. So lawn's not productive in that sense. So we want to reduce the area that's in lawn and still have it as a mechanism for guiding you through the landscape. It's also a really important cue for care. So what we're trying to do is get more plants into our residential landscapes. And by the way, we have, 135 million acres of residential landscapes in this country. It's a huge area. But the culture is to have it neat as a pin, not share it with nature. Lawn is a really important part of that. And what we want to do is slowly change that, or maybe quickly change that, by getting a lot more plants into these landscapes, a lot more functional plants, ones that are actually supporting food webs and encouraging other creatures to live with us. But we want to do it in a culturally acceptable way. That's where lawn can play an important part, because people know that manicured lawn is what the culture's all about. That's what we call a cue for care. So when you have parts of your lawn remaining in your yard, you keep it mowed, you keep it manicured, and that sends the message to your neighbors that you do understand the culture. You're not trying to be a rebel. You're just having less of this unproductive landscape. Good place to use lawn would be along strips along your driveway or along the sidewalk in front. Keep that manicured. And that usually is enough to convince people that you're really part of the culture. The plants behind the lawn, though, have a very important function. Okay, we're going to make several points about this planting here. When we put it in years ago, the front was lined with cardinal flower, beautiful red flowers. It really was designed not just for function, but for beauty. But this represents the fact that landscapes change, gardens change, they're very dynamic. Every single year it's going to look a little bit different, unless you put a lot of effort into keeping it the same, and that's not what we're talking about here. So a number of these plants have done really well. They forced the cardinal flower pretty much out. We have a number of helianthus getting ready in the background. I want to focus on the Joe Pye over here. As you can see, it gets quite tall. This area is a little bit low. Joe Pye is typically found in wetter areas, although it does just fine in dry areas. But it's a great nectar plant. It comes out pretty much the same time as butterfly bush does. Of course, butterfly bush is a non-native plant, makes lots of nectar, a lot of butterflies go to it. People love it for that reason, and they think they're really helping the butterflies by planting butterfly bush. Well, they are providing a lot of nectar, and things that need nectar do use it. But Joe Pye provides a lot of nectar as well. It's also the host plant for 35 species of moths. So it's part of the living community that has interacted with the things around it for many, many thousands of years, whereas butterfly bush hasn't interacted at all. So it's not the host plant for any of the butterflies that you're trying to help, or any moths either. It also has demonstrated invasive qualities. So there are places where butterfly bush is now a major invasive species. That's definitely true in parts of the West. I have grandchildren in Portland, Oregon, and there are big parts of Portland that are covered with butterfly bush. Entire Hawaiian islands are covered with butterfly bush. The big restoration up along the Delaware Water Gap, where the Palmerton zinc smelter used to be, they have two major invasive species there. One is ailanthus and the other is butterfly bush. So there's some downsides to butterfly bush, and Joe Pye is a really good alternative. You can grow it. There's a smaller species, Eupatorium. I think they changed the genus actually, but it used to be Eupatorium dubium. It can be grown in a big flower pot right there on your front steps, and the butterflies do come and use it. Okay, there are just some basics of design that anybody can learn without a lot of trouble, and that is you put the tall plants in the back and the short plants in the front. So there's the Joe Pye in the back, making a very nice background that's aesthetically pleasing but also ecologically productive. And then we've got Monarda up here in the front. Baptisia is already bloomed. It's in seed at this point. Monarda is, well, there's a couple species that are really good pollinator plants. And by that I mean they're providing particularly the nectar for a number of pollinators, including hummingbirds, but a number of sphinx moths, a number of bees, bumblebees. You've got a pink one, you've got a red one, you've got several species that are not all that pretty, but they are real magnets for native bees, like Monarda punctatum. It's just starting to get more common in the nursery trade. It's shorter, not as showy, but again, if we're talking about native bees, we've got about 4,000 species of native bees in this country, in North America, I should say. One species of honeybee. Yeah, we care about the honeybee, but we care about those native bees as well. They were doing just about all the pollination before we brought the honeybee over. And they're all in decline. And they're in decline for the same reason that everything's in decline. They've lost their habitat. Habitat's not just a place to live, it's the food to eat. And bees need flowering plants all season long, from early March all the way through late or very early November. There are different species of native bees out looking for forage. So what you want to do is try to plant so that you have something blooming in your yard at all times. And unless you have a big yard, that's pretty hard to do. So think of your entire neighborhood, coordinate with your neighbors and say, well, you know, you've got the space in the sun to have something blooming in July. I'm going to do it in June, and somebody else can do it in September. The late season, we've got a lot of things that bloom in the spring and a lot of things that bloom in the end of the summer and fall. Very few things actually bloom right in the middle of summer, right now. So what is this? This is the end of July. Things like sweet pepper bush, clethra, is just coming into bloom. Maybe we'll find some here in a minute. Button bush has already passed. It doesn't bloom very long, but it's a great nectar plant for butterflies. Our hollies, we'll find some of them as well. Actually, there's one right over there. Winterberry holly, Ilexpertisalata. Tiny little white flowers. You don't even know it's in bloom, but it's a great plant for native bees. So when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. I know we want showy plants for ourselves, but you want these powerhouses, and many of them are woody plants, to supply the nectar for these bees as we move through the season. Another good point, most of our trees are flowering plants as well. Some of them, like the oaks, are wind pollinated, but they still provide a lot of pollen for native bees. They hang down, catkins hang down, they're covered with pollen, and the bees go to them, get the pollen. They don't move it to the female flowers, so they are not officially pollinators, but that is a source of protein to keep those early season bees going. Native willows are really important in that regard. Redbud is really important. Later in the season, our goldenrods, our fall blooming asters, and after these Joe Pies are done, the fall blooming asters come out here. It's just a riot of purple, and the monarchs come and hang from them. It's really a productive place. Critically important for our monarchs, because not only do they need milkweed that's the nourishment for the caterpillar, but they also need the nectar resources to get from wherever they are, as far north as Canada, all the way down to mountains just north of Mexico City. In other words, they've got to fuel that migration with the nectar of plants that are in bloom from late August all the way through late October. So those fall blooming plants are really important for our poor monarch, which, by the way, this week was listed as an endangered species by the International Union for Conservation, IUCN of Nature, International Union for Conservation in Nature. Notice the U.S. did not put the monarch on the endangered species list, but the IUCN has, just because it's lost 75%, 85%, 95% of its population, depending on which group you're looking at. Over 99% of the monarchs in California are gone. This species is headed for extinction unless we get busy and do something about it. So having that fall forage for the monarchs as they migrate is an important contribution. One other thing about making a pollinator garden, you want to focus on plants that are really good for specialist pollinators. We have specialist pollinators that can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera, and we have generalist pollinators that can use pollen from a number of different plants. So the honeybee is a generalist pollinator. Many of our bumblebees are generalist pollinators. But over a third of that 4,000 species of native bees we have are specialist pollinators. They can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. So for example, around here, goldenrod supports 14 species of bees that can only reproduce on goldenrod pollen. So if you have goldenrod in your yard in bloom, you could support 14 species of native bees that won't be there if you don't have goldenrod. Asters around here support another 12 species. Enothera, evening primrose, is very high. Perennial sunflower is very high. When you put all those plants together, you can have 40, 50 species of native bees that won't be able to reproduce in your yard if you don't have them. So that's focusing on those specialists. The good news is the generalists use those plants too. So if you focus on the specialist, you're covering all your bases. If you only plant for generalists, you've lost the specialists. So you see white clover dotting the grass here, and that's very nice for honeybees and some bumblebees, and I see honeybees working it right now. But it's a non-native plant that's providing nectar and some pollen. Of course, the honeybee is non-native as well. And it's not satisfying the needs of any of our specialist bees. So it's a little confusing here. People will plant a plant like a zinnia, which has a lot of nectar and a lot of things go to it, and they say, oh, look at all the bees, I'm really helping the pollinators. Well, you're helping a few species of pollinators, but we want to help as many species as possible, particularly those specialists. And that's going to be a native plant. There aren't any non-natives that are going to help specialists. Okay, right behind me is a persimmon. And if you've never had a persimmon fruit, I suggest you have one this fall. They're delicious. Texture, you have to get used to it. They taste the best when they look like they're rotting, and people have to get used to that. But this tree is loaded with persimmons, so it's going to be a big producer this year. Persimmons are dioecious, meaning one specimen has female flowers and the other specimen has male flowers. And if you don't have both a male and a female in your yard, you're not going to have any persimmons. Sometimes when you have both a male and female, you still don't get any persimmons. I've got a lot of persimmons at home. I know I've got males and females because I got one persimmon one year, but nothing the other years. And I still haven't figured out why I'm not getting any persimmons. But most people have a lot of good luck with it. This is eating locally. So you can eat persimmons. You can put pawpaws in your yard and get good pawpaw production. There's lots of nuts. You know, your hickories and your black walnut if you want to go to the trouble. So there's a lot of local plants that do produce food that we can use if you want to eat locally, if you want to do what's called permaculture, grow your food right at home in a natural way. Persimmon would be an important component to that. Okay, so if our goal is to reduce the area that's in lawn and get productive plants in place of that lawn, sometimes you have a row of trees and then lawn goes right up to it. You can reduce the area in lawn if you have plantings that gradually move down to the area that you keep in lawn. And a great way to do that is with buckeyes, particularly bottlebrush buckeye. This is bottlebrush buckeye. It has already bloomed, but when it puts out I don't know if it's called a raceme or not, lots of little flowers on it. I've got a picture of one from my house that had 5 swallowtail butterflies on a single one of these stalks at the same time. So it's a wonderful plant for butterflies during the day, but it can get quite large and transition down and cover a great area that used to be in lawn. Another plus for these buckeyes is that it's one of the few plants that are deer resistant. And of course we have an overabundance of deer most places, so having a productive plant that's deer resistant is a plus. Okay, you're looking at a tiger swallowtail nectaring on Jode pie. One of the most common questions I've gotten in recent years, particularly in the early part of the summer, is where have all the butterflies gone? And at least in the mid-Atlantic states, we've had a series of very cold, wet springs, which is very hard on overwintering butterflies. The chrysalids get a disease and they never emerge. So it's weather really that has depressed the populations of our butterflies. And I always tell people be patient. They'll typically bounce back starting the end of July and in August. And so this is a tiger swallowtail, one of the first I've seen this year actually. They're just starting to come out this week. A second generation. The few that made it through the cool, wet spring we had reproduced, and now these are their offspring, and they'll do it again. They'll be around right through the end of September. One of the things we've learned in our lab is that not all native plants are equally productive. So we used to think native good, non-native not so good. There are a lot of natives that aren't all that productive as well. So we want to focus on the ones that are producing the most food. Remember, one of the major ecological jobs that plants do is to capture energy from the sun and through photosynthesis turn it into food. That's the food that keeps all the animals on terrestrial Earth alive. If that food stays in the plant, you don't have any animals. So you have to have energy transfer from plants to other animals. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat something else that ate plants. So for example, birds aren't eating the plant, they're eating caterpillars that are on the plant. And it turns out that caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater worldwide. So we're looking for plants that make a lot of caterpillars. It makes it easy to figure out what's a really productive plant, a contributor, versus one that's not contributing so much. So behind me, there are 2 plants. One is a tulip tree, Lariadendum tulipifera, the tallest, straightest tree in our forests. It's a wonderful native plant. If you go through the literature and you count up all the species of caterpillars that eat tulip tree, you will come up with the answer of 21 species. That sounds good. But right next to that tree is a black cherry, and if you count up all the species that eat black cherry, it's 456. So it's a much more productive plant than tulip trees. So I'm not saying we're never going to plant tulip trees, but if you find you've got a tulip tree monoculture, then you might want to diversify it. Behind the black cherry is a pin oak. You can't see it from here, but it's there, and that is the most productive plant of all, at least the oaks are. So in the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species of caterpillar. And there's no other plant genus that comes close to that. So we call those really productive ones keystone plants. And I like to think of keystone plants as the 2x4s in the ecological house that we're building. They're the things holding up that house. They're making the most food and passing it on. So you need to have them in your yard. Many of the other plants are contributing, you know, dribs and drabs here and there. It's all important for diversity, but you don't want to just have the low contributors. You want to have the high contributors as well. So here we have common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, doing what it's supposed to do, and that is support monarchs. We actually do have a young monarch right here, hard to see because he's so small, but he will grow rapidly. Monarch populations have been very depressed, so to see reproduction on our milkweeds is always heartening. Look at where the milkweeds are growing here. This is not it is a milkweed patch, but it's many other things as well. The dominant plant you see here is goldenrod. It's not in bloom yet, but when it is, it will be beautiful. Goldenrod supports 110 species of caterpillars. So in terms of numbers, it's much more productive than milkweed. And it also is helping the monarch in terms of making that nectar that monarchs will use when they're migrating. And interspersed is also a number of those fall blooming asters. So this is a really productive little section of this planting. If you have a couple of acres of lawn and you're wondering what to do with it, this would be an eastern meadow that once it's established, the only thing you would have to do in terms of maintenance is keep the woody plants out. But when it's growing, I mean, this is probably Canada goldenrod, which is Solidago canadensis. It's very aggressive. People will always say, don't plant it. But if you're trying to outcompete non-natives, plant it. It's one of the few things that will do a good job in outcompeting stiltgrass and many of the other things that try to invade your meadow. So when you have a really productive plant that can outcompete non-natives that aren't productive at all, don't hesitate to use it when you have the space. All right, here we have buttonbush. Unfortunately, it's past its bloom. That's one of its downsides. Its bloom does not last very long. But when it's in bloom, it's a wonderful display, and it's also a great source of nectar in the middle of the summer for nectar-seeking insects, particularly butterflies. Buttonbush can grow in standing water, so it's very good in wet areas, but it doesn't need wet areas. It can also grow where it's completely dry. So if you have a wet area and you're wondering what to put there, buttonbush is a good choice. So is sweet pepper bush, that can grow in moist areas. Ilexpertisalata, those things we talked about as being really good for pollinators, Ilexpertisalata Winterberry can grow in standing water. So wet areas typically dismay a lot of homeowners, but they're things that do well in water, even if they don't absolutely need it. Here we mentioned keystone plants, the ones that are passing on a lot of energy. Oaks are number one. Cherries, prunus, number two, but tied with cherries is salix, willows. We have over 100 species of willows in North America. In the mid-Atlantic states, not so many. The black willow is the most common one. It's a small tree. Pussy willow, native pussy willow, salix discolor, another wonderful choice. Not that many species. As you move farther north, though, a lot of species come in. A little farther west, you get a lot of species along riverbanks, sand willow, and things like that. But any species of native willow is going to support an awful lot. So again, if you have an area that is low and you're wondering what to put in it, willows are great choices. Don't plant a willow over your septic tank or any place where it's going to grow its roots and seek out moisture, because it can cause some structural problems in those cases. But otherwise, it's a really, really productive plant that should be part of every landscape when possible. More pluses about willows is that they bloom very early in the season when very few other things are in bloom. So the very first species of native bees to come out, often Calides bees and a few other species, really depend on willow pollen to get them going in the season. It's also the host plant for viceroy butterflies, for morning cloak butterflies. for a number of species of moths. So again, very, very productive plant. Okay, we talk about milkweeds being important for monarchs, and they certainly are, but there are other specialists that use milkweeds. There's 3 species of red and black beetles that we call milkweed beetles. We're looking at one of them here. They're in the genus Tetraopes, meaning 4 eyes. And what that means is the antenna comes out right in the middle of the compound eye and splits it into 2 pieces, so it looks like they have 4 separate eyes. And they're doing what you always see them doing. It looks like they're mating, but actually this is called mate guarding, where the male is riding the female to make sure another male doesn't mate with her. He's already mated with her, and he wants to make sure she uses his sperm to fertilize her eggs. So he will stay on her back for a long period trying to make sure that happens. You can recognize milkweed beetle damage. This is typical right here. One of the major challenges in eating milkweed is getting around the sticky latex defense. So this is what gives milkweeds its name. When you rip a leaf, you get all this white goo that comes out. If you put that on your finger and let it sit there for a minute or 2, it'll start to gel. It's actually a type of latex, and when it gets in contact with oxygen, it turns into something like chewing gum. And this is the defense, one of the defenses of milkweed. If a monarch caterpillar gets that wiped on its mouth parts, it glues its mouth shut, and then the caterpillar will starve to death. And that's true with these beetles, true. It's true with anything that eats milkweed. So they have to find a way around that sticky latex sap. And they do that by snipping. Let me see if I can find it. Right here you see where the beetles snipped the midrib, right there, right there, right there, and right there. And they keep doing it repeatedly until they block the flow of the sticky latex sap. And that means the end of the leaf now can be eaten and it's sap free. Monarch caterpillars do the same thing. They don't snip the leaf. They will chew through the midrib, and everything after, beyond where they chewed through the midrib, then is latex free. And you often see leaves flagged like this after a monarch has visited the plant. It's a good way to find monarchs. Just look for flagged leaves and you know that a monarch has been there and has snipped the latex. So that's a behavioral defense that allows them to eat milkweeds that most other insects don't have. That's an advantage of specializing. They've gotten really good at getting around the defense of this particular plant. The downside of specializing is that they're locked into milkweed now. They haven't developed the ability to eat anything else. Works out fine for the monarchs or the Tetraopes beetles as long as there's milkweed in the landscape. But if we take it out and put hostas in, the beetles or the monarch can't eat hosta, so they have to leave that landscape. They either starve to death or they go find milkweed someplace else. That's the downside of specialization. Thing of it is, 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, so we have to start to garden in a way that satisfies the needs of all of those insects, or we lose them all and then you have food web collapse. I might mention or remind you why we need so many caterpillars out there. Because they're transferring the energy to other animals, it takes a lot of caterpillars to do that. And we have data from chickadees that says it's 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars necessary to make 1 clutch of Carolina chickadee. That's a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And that's just to get it to the point where it leaves the nest. After it leaves the nest, the spotted lanternfly has just flown by. After it leaves the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars necessary to make 1 clutch of a tiny little bird. And we want birds of a lot of species. We want more than one couple in our yards. So we need to have landscapes that produce an awful lot of caterpillars. And our non-native plants don't do that. That's the big push for native plants. Yeah, that's a spotted lanternfly. You probably already know about spotted lanternflies. It might be the very latest of a whole series of insects we've introduced from other continents. So we talk about invasive plants not being a great idea for our ecosystems. Invasive insects are a terrible idea as well. Because these things, they're not evil. They just are here without any of their natural enemies. not only the things that eat spotted lanternflies, but also the diseases that keep them in check over in Asia. These guys are suckers, which means they're sucking primarily phloem from plants. They love fruit, so they clobber apples and grapes very hard in the apple and grape industry. And of course, those fruits are not protected at all, so it's really just sugar water, and the spotted lanternfly loves it. They also develop best. They love Ailanthus, another plant from Asia. So if you want to minimize the spotted lanternfly problem on your property, make sure you've gotten rid of all of your Ailanthus. Ailanthus has been here 100 years. We've told people they've got to get rid of it, but this is a good motivation now, because these guys could be really, really numerous. All right, people are often looking for shrubs in their yard. We've got a lot of native trees, a lot of native herbaceous plants. Not that many native shrubs, at least in the east, that work well in landscapes. But this is one of them that does. This is Viburnum nudum. We have Viburnum dentatum, arrowwood viburnum, very commonly used. And viburnums are very highly ranked. They support well over 100 species of caterpillars. So they fit the middle horizontal niche that you're looking for. When you build a landscape, you don't want to have canopy trees and then just air down to the ground. You want a layered landscape that will provide habitat, substrate for breeding birds. Everybody thinks birds make nests in the trees, and some of them do, but a lot of them make them in this shrub layer. They like to breed fairly low. So having this middle layer in your landscape is very valuable. It's also important in terms of breaking up the destructive power of a downpour. You don't think of rain as being able to compact soil, but it can. You get those thunderstorms and it pounds down. If the very first thing that it hits is soil, it will compact that soil. But when you have a canopy and then a subcanopy and an understory, it breaks up the power of those raindrops, and then you just get gentle dripping and your soil remains uncompacted, which is another important feature of healthy soils. So liberal use of these shrubs is highly recommended. But look at the berries that are developing here. They're producing really valuable berries, and they're valuable because they are ripe in the fall and they're very high in fat. Almost 50% fat in our native viburnums berries. That's important because the migrating birds that eat those berries are looking for high fat berries. Fat provides the energy that fuels that migration. They're eating insects as they go as well, but they really seek out these high fat berries. And you say, well, you know, the non-natives are making berries as well, multiflora rose and autumn olive and buckthorn. And it's true, but those berries are really low in fat. They're high in sugar and they're only about 1% fat. So they're there in the landscape, but they're not providing the nutrition that our migrating birds need. One other plant I want to mention that's very good in a wet situation, particularly along ponds or lakes. You never want to have lawn going down to your pond. You want to have planted right up to the edge. Alders fill that niche really, really well along a river, a stream, or a pond. And that's what you're looking at back there, one of the species of alders. It's a very highly ranked plant, produces an awful lot of insects to support those birds. It's right next to the Winterberry, which has green berries now, but in the winter they of course turn bright red, and it's got winter color all through the winter. And they provide good food for the birds, particularly late in the winter when those berries become more palatable. So more examples of plants you can put in a wet area.
So you saw Emma earlier in the video on the ground because she was doing some field work. This is Emma Jonas, and Emma is a graduate student working with Dr. Tallamy on a field project and doing some research with him. And Emma's going to tell us a little bit about her research right now.
So conservationists often recommend what they call soft landings underneath your trees for landscaping. What is most often used under trees is grass in suburban landscapes. And when you're mowing that grass, you're compacting the soil and you're affecting the moisture. And those two factors really influence how caterpillars are able to pupate and to survive to adulthood and make the next generation of caterpillars. So what I'm going to be doing is comparing grass to different types of ground covers underneath trees, because Lepidoptera will come down and start to wander when they're done eating to find their pupation place. So I'm going to be looking at different types of ground covers, low ground covers like these we have here, versus maybe a layer of leaves or pine needles, which will also protect the soil. And I'm also going to compare that to a woody understory or layered understory, and just basically place the caterpillars on the ground and watch them and determine how far they had to travel to find a pupation spot that they prefer, and also how long it took them, because that is energy that they're trying to conserve, and the farther they have to wander to find a safe place, the more vulnerable they are to disease and parasitism and predation. And so I'm going to be finding what the best ground cover is to landscape under your trees, or find data on that, because we know it is probably not grass. And then hopefully be able to better make recommendations for people.
I'm really pleased to hear about your research, because for those of us who have read Dr. Tallamy's work, you start wondering, well, how do they know all these things? And now you're giving us a little bit of insight when you start recommending, okay, a certain ground cover. You're recommending that based on the fact that you have gotten down on your knees, counted what caterpillars were, how many there were, where they were there more in this area, more in that area. So it's really exciting to learn about how the information that is presented to us is discovered.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this with everybody.
So years ago, I was thinking about all the area that we have in lawn in North America, that 44 million acres, an area the size of New England. And I said, well, gee, what would happen if we cut that area in half? What would happen if we took a half our lawn and replanted it with productive plants? Well, that would give us at least 20 million acres. How big is that? And I started to add up the area of all the big national parks in our country. And I added them all up, including Denali, and they still didn't reach 20 million acres. So I said, well, gee, we could create a new national park. And if we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. Sounded like a fun idea, but it's blossomed. We actually now have a website, homegrownnationalpark.org, put together by Michelle Alfanderi, an official nonprofit now. And the goal is to actually reach the non-choir, reach people who don't realize that their yard is an important component of the future of conservation. So we're trying to use this form of social media to spread the message that everybody is responsible for conservation, because everybody depends on healthy ecosystems. So there's a lot of information on homegrownnationalpark.org to tell you how you can create landscapes like what we've just talked about, how you can convert your part of your yard. Even if you put a single aster in a flower pot, you have added to the productivity of your property. And what you do is you go to the website, it's free, and you register your property and say, I'm gonna conserve, I'm gonna re-landscape this much area. Just a rough estimate. And then your piece of your county is going to light up. And we're working with a tech company right now so that we can watch the entire US light up as people join Homegrown National Park. We've got about 19,000 people that are signed up already, but we need more, 19 million maybe. So please spread the word. Everybody should join Homegrown National Park to encourage others to do it. You know, we're all in the same conservation tribe now. We're on the same team trying to reach a common goal that we can visualize on the map.
So thank you everyone for watching Native Plant Channel. Thank you so much, Dr. Tallamy. I'm sure that not only have I learned so much, but our viewers have learned so much from you. It's been wonderful to be here on the grounds of the University of Delaware to see where a lot of this research is taking place. And I hope that this inspires everyone to plant those native plants in their garden. This has been such a fantastic day. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Tallamy.
No, you're quite welcome.
And have a great day, and please take a look at Homegrown National Park and get yourself on the map.